Just an average guy in an average town until the first full moon.
Has anything ever happened to you that was so weird? Whoa! Achoo!
An explanation is probably long overdue.
Michael J. Fox stars in Teen Wolf at 8 o'clock tomorrow here on BBC One.
Dick Van Dyke and Sally Ann Howes fly drive to the music of Chitty, Chitty, Bang, Bang in this afternoon's film in 40 minutes. Over on 2, in just under 5 minutes, our very young viewers can join Greenclaws at a fancy dress party.
This is BBC One. Now the regional news. Good afternoon. Health officials in Rotherham have begun an investigation after a secretary to a leading surgeon failed to inform a number of patients that they needed operations. A 5-man team at Rotherham District General Hospital is checking waiting lists to see which patients are affected. A spokesman said that some patients who were not called to appointments could have included people who were seriously ill. However, the hospital could provide no explanation as to what went wrong. The American Environment Protection Agency has told the British government that a controversial consignment of waste being stored at a South Yorkshire recycling firm is safe. They say tests on the drums at Wath Recycling show the material is not hazardous. The government had hoped the agency would force the American company which originated the waste to take it back. A report is to be published shortly into an oil tanker collision in the Humber estuary last September. Around 70 tons of crude oil spilled from the Iberian-registered supertanker, the Phillips Oklahoma, when it collided with another tanker, the Fiona. The crews were airlifted to safety and an emergency operation was launched to disperse a 21-mile oil slick, which threatened to spread to the Lincolnshire coast. The inquiry is expected to focus on the way the ships collided in calm seas. Police have launched an internal inquiry after a middle-aged woman died in a cell on Humberside. Marie Priestman of Nelson Street in Cleethorpes was taken into custody last night following a street disturbance. She was found dead shortly afterwards in a cell at the town's police station. A police spokesman said there were no suspicious circumstances. Plans have been unveiled to turn the site of the former RAF base at Binbrook in Lincolnshire into a new technology centre and leisure complex. The plans would mean the site could become one of the county's biggest industrial centres and a major tourist attraction. A mystery bidder wants to transform the officers' mess into a major health and leisure facility, with the airmen's former homes becoming a scenic garden village. West Lindsey councillors will consider the proposals next week. And finally, on Look North tonight, we'll be taking a look at all the main stories of the 80s in our region. Among the highlights are the unveiling of York Minster's fire-damaged rose window, the opening of the Humber Bridge, and the arrival of a very special visitor, Concorde. And that's the news so far this lunchtime. Now let's take a look at the region's weather. All parts will remain cloudy both this afternoon and tonight, and although there may be a spot of drizzle, most places will stay dry. Temperatures will be on the cold side, around 5 degrees Celsius, that's 41 degrees Fahrenheit this afternoon, falling to a minimum of around 1 degree Celsius, that's 34 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. Winds will remain light southeasterly, and the outlook for tomorrow mainly dry with a good deal of cloud and rather cold.
The coffee shop in Neighbours provides a particularly warm welcome in 15 minutes here on BBC One after the news at 1 o'clock with Andrew Harvey.
Good afternoon. The headlines at 1 o'clock. Britain's trade deficit is down by more than £300 million. Share prices are up and sterling has recovered ground. Riot police in Hong Kong use tear gas as violence breaks out in the detention camps. And from playwright to president, Václav Havel is Czechoslovakia's new leader. Britain's trade gap with the rest of the world is down to its lowest level for 8 months. The current account deficit in November was just over £1.4 billion. That's an improvement of £300 million on October. It's better than the city had expected, and shares rallied on the news. But Britain is still heading towards a record annual deficit of more than £20 billion.
Britain's deficit in November was better than most city analysts had expected. Since October, Britain's trade gap has narrowed by £300 million. These are the last trade figures to be published this year, and whilst they show some improvement, the picture for 1989 remains poor. The balance of payments worsened steadily through 1989, reaching a peak of £2.2 billion. Since then, they've improved as exports rose, but today's figure shows the deficit remains substantial.
Well, obviously 1989 has been a very poor year. The last few months have shown some degree of improvement in trade, but this has been a long time in coming, and I think that the year will be looked back upon as one of some disappointment as far as the present Chancellor and the former Chancellor are concerned.
Manufacturing exports did little to help narrow the trade gap. They hardly grew at all during November, despite a weaker pound, which makes British goods cheaper abroad. The main reason for today's improvement in Britain's trade was a big drop in imports, as high interest rates cut deep into consumer spending. But imports remain high, and interest rates at 15% are holding exporters back. So there's nothing in these figures to suggest that 1990 will be an easy year for the markets, as Britain's trade remains deep in the red.
Riot police in Hong Kong have used tear gas during disturbances at a detention centre for Vietnamese boat people. The trouble started when inmates threw stones at guards who were searching for weapons. It's thought the camp houses the next group of boat people who are to be forced to return to Vietnam.
The authorities were expecting trouble in the Chimawan camp following a series of violent incidents. A police tactical unit landed on the island as relief workers and United Nations refugee officials tried to persuade the Vietnamese to cooperate, but that didn't work. The boat people put women and children around the perimeter fence as a screen for the demonstrations in the middle of the compound. Eventually, several hundred riot police stormed the camp using tear gas. The Vietnamese replied with stones. The reason for today's militancy at this prison camp is that it's widely believed the next batch of Vietnamese to be forcibly repatriated will be chosen from among them. The assumption is the authorities carried out today's raid as the first step in the repatriation process. They in effect disarm many of the Vietnamese, confiscating over 400 homemade weapons. Several children were hurt today, and more than 20 police and prison guards. As the rioting went on, another plane load of boat people were willingly leaving the colony. This group, returning home on a United Nations charter flight, bring to 900 the number who've voluntarily gone back to Hanoi this year. They receive generous financial incentives. But they're the exceptions. The bulk of the 40,000 or more boat people here, who are unlikely to qualify for refugee status, show no sign of giving up. And with Hong Kong pledged to carry out the next stage of enforced repatriation early in the new year, more trouble in the camp seems inevitable. Brian Barron, BBC News, Hong Kong.
Václav Havel, the Czech playwright who spent 5 years in jail for his human rights campaigning, has been sworn in as the country's new president. He was denounced for many years by the communist media as an enemy of the state, but today he pledged himself to serve as president for 6 months until free elections are held.
For weeks, the crowds have been chanting Havel to the castle. This morning, Václav Havel went to Prague Castle to be inaugurated as the first president of the new Czechoslovakia. It was an extraordinary moment as the dissident who spent years in jail accepted the country's supreme office. Havel had been elected by a special session of Parliament. His only real rival had been Alexander Dubček, the leader of the 1968 Prague Spring. But Dubček yesterday accepted the post of parliamentary speaker to leave the way clear for Havel. Havel was the unquestioned leader of the 1989 uprising. He's never been a natural politician. He's a shy man whose life has been spent writing plays for other people to perform. But this November he became both the author and the lead character of a revolution. Havel was born into a wealthy family, but when the communists took power in 1948, his family's assets were confiscated. Havel started work as a stagehand, and then he began to write plays which were savagely critical of the communists. He was imprisoned in this labour camp for 4.5 years. His only crime was to argue that political prisoners should be freed. In 1978, he led a group of dissidents to meet a like-minded group of Poles at the border between the two countries, who then would have believed that these rebel picnickers would be government leaders just 10 years later.
Romania's new leaders have taken further steps towards democracy. The National Salvation Front, which has effectively held power since the overthrow of Nicolae Ceausescu, has appointed more government ministers. It's also announced sweeping reforms, abolishing communist rule and introducing a multi-party system. Mike Donkin has been to Arad, where the local front committee is learning that freedom has its problems too.
Around the clock, the town hall, once the Communist Party's stronghold, has been the hub of the People's Revolution here. Security has been unrelenting as they've started by obliterating all memories of the hated old regime. Arad's church pastors joined the confused throngs in the corridors as they worked out what comes next. The official Committee for Democracy has lawyers, teachers and the army in its ranks. It's decided that the guilty will be punished. Securitate prisoners are being held at a secret location and military tribunals will judge them. The new man in charge in Arad led the street demonstrations here, but he monitors Free Romanian television for guidance on more positive post-revolutionary policies. Romania's new town hall bosses still have the tanks standing by in the yard, but information, they believe, is their best weapon. Arad's fledgling first democratic newspaper is called Adevărul, the truth. These battered old machines previously committed only the thoughts of the Communist Party to print. Now they're free to feed unthinkable new ideas to a people hungry for news. The scene's chaotic, but it is only the third day of peace here, they say, and it took God 7 to make the world. Mike Donkin, BBC News, Arad.
Emergency relief is still pouring into Romania from other parts of the world, even though the authorities there now say the immediate medical emergency is over. 20 tons of supplies were loaded onto 2 planes at Heathrow Airport this morning. They were paid for by readers of the Daily Mirror, while other items were donated by medical and pharmaceutical firms. The British Red Cross appeal has now reached £600,000. Ambulance crews in Greater Manchester are to step up their industrial action from midnight. They've decided to ban the use of radios in ambulances and to refuse to transfer patients between hospitals. In London, union leaders have called on Scotland Yard to lift its ban on passing emergency calls to ambulance crews over the New Year period.
Manchester crews say they've decided on action because they're frustrated with events over the Christmas period, including the involvement of private ambulances and the St John Brigade. North West Regional Health Authorities say they're determined to maintain the accident and emergency service, although they may have to bring in the police to help. Meanwhile, in London, ambulance managers say they've made contingency plans to cope with the large numbers expected in Trafalgar Square. But the unions claim they won't be able to cope without the suspended ambulancemen. Scotland Yard say they definitely won't be calling on suspended ambulancemen, although they concede there could be delays. This morning, a further 18 ambulance staff were suspended after they refused to transfer from regional offices to cover for striking colleagues at headquarters in Waterloo.
The Vatican has called the United States an occupying power in Panama. It said that the US government had no right to demand the handing over of the ousted military leader General Manuel Noriega, who sought refuge in the Vatican embassy in Panama City. The spokesman also said that harassment by American troops playing loud rock music outside the embassy was unacceptable.
It started as a siege, but it's turning into a farce. Negotiations at the Vatican embassy continue in the street, but little progress is being made. The Vatican has refused to turn the fugitive general over to the Americans, who want him to face drug trafficking charges in a US court. American troops have turned to psychological tactics to wear down General Noriega. The embassy is being barraged with heavy rock music from loudspeakers. Few see much point in this strategy. General Noriega is one of the world's masters in psychological warfare. Panamanians, including the Catholic Church here, are clamoring for justice. Humanitarian aid supplies are arriving from the United States, Europe and Latin America. Those displaced from the areas worst hit by the American invasion are being fed in a refugee camp close to a U.S. military base. Children are receiving late Christmas presents. And after over a week of operating daylight hours only, the Panama Canal has returned to full operation as canal officials try to reduce a long backlog of vessels waiting off the coast.
And that's all for now. The next news on BBC One is at 6 o'clock. Good afternoon.